Welcome to Paulogia and another edition of Ham and Egg News, where we react to Can Ham reacting to things. If you're new to the channel, take a second to tap on the subscribe button so that you'll be notified when new science, theology, and news videos come out.
All right, International Code of Phylogenetic Nomenclature, or the Phylocode.
Wait a minute, are they going to try to answer the phylogeny challenge?
Don't get your hopes up, Arn. The closest they've come is hiring someone new who can actually pronounce phylogeny.
Oh, well, that's good, because up to now they've been calling it baraminology, which was an attempt to answer the phylogeny challenge without calling it that. They want to create this idea of an orchard of these separately created kinds when each of these genus obviously sit within the same family of these certain groups. And all of these other families fall into 2 or 3 different orders, as you will, and the taxonomic tree still exists exactly as it is. It's just that they can't account for it.
Well, you're obviously the perfect person to talk about this, but before we move on, in case someone's not familiar, can you remind us what the phylogeny challenge is?
The phylogeny challenge, in summary, is to identify created kinds that they're advocating for. Find 2 or 3 different species that scientists would consider closely related, but that creationists say are actually unrelated, that they're specially created. And of course, nobody can do that because everything that you can find is obviously closely related taxonomically. And it's not just that what they call evolutionists determined that. By their own admission, creationists came up with this scheme, realizing that these things are actually grouped this way. And this type of branching tree pattern that Carolus Linnaeus identified does not fit with a creationist paradigm. Now, Answers in Genesis lies about that. They want you to believe something else. But the fact is that Carolus Linnaeus himself, as a creationist, could not come up with an answer for this. He did not think that speciation was possible. He argued that new species could not come about except by special creation. So how could this branching tree pattern exist of sets within sets within sets within sets? When you go to every parent set, it's inclusive of more and more sets. And that's the branching tree pattern that he illustrated. That is consistent with evolution, but it doesn't fit with creationism at all. And nor does it fit with baraminology, which is a completely artificial and arbitrary construct trying to conceal that fact.
Well, let's see how they react to what the actual scientists are doing.
All right, International Code of Phylogenetic Nomenclature, or the Phylocode. So it was almost 300.
I just fell asleep. Can you wake me up?
I know. I know. It's
He's
a
not the
genetic thing, yes.
Oh, he's not a scientist? I'm so glad you pointed that out.
But it was about close to 300 years ago when Carl Linnaeus first, created our taxonomy system that we use today to classify animals according to their different kinds, by kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
Except that there's no such thing as a kind. That's the phylogeny challenge. You're supposed to show what a kind is and how we tell one kind from another kind. And it can't be the way that certain evangelicals have already stated, that even a 5-year-old can tell. And even a 5-year-old can tell that dogs and cats are more closely related and that sheep and goats are more closely related than either group is to each other. Even a 5-year-old can tell that. So that doesn't work. You have to come up with an actual determinant.
So as I was reading through this, and I've known about this for some time, that they've really been upset, so to speak, about the Linnaeus system of classification. So that's what we typically use today when she was talking about kingdom, phylum, class, order. That was set up in the 1700s by Carl Linnaeus, and he was a Christian, and he was a creationist. And his contemporaries actually would say, God created, Linnaeus organized. And so he just... Because they do. They fall into groups. Any child can pick that out and see that and understand that. And so that's what he did through his naming. But it doesn't fit because some of the groupings, though, don't fit the proposed evolutionary relationship.
There are no groups that do not fit an evolutionary relationship. The construct that Carolus Linnaeus came up with did not fit a creationist concept. That's why he was arguing that he could not distinguish man from ape. He famously said that, if I had said that, man was ape or ape was man, then that he would fall under the ban of all ecclesiastics. But, as a scientist, he should have said that. And in fact, he did classify chimpanzees and orangutans as subsets of human, Homo troglodyte and Homo nocturnus, respectively. Carolus Linnaeus discovered something that didn't fit the creationist perspective. This woman is being deliberately deceptive. It's not that we are upset at any damn thing. It's not that we have to change it. It's that they have to change it. That's why they invented baraminology. What we're talking about is that people, using their arbitrary methods or their imperfect perceptions, might decide that a cougar and a cheetah are very different things, because we have a tendency, especially back a century or two ago, people had a tendency to look at the surface of something rather than the basis or the essence of that thing. So they would look at a cheetah and identify that as being distinctly different than a cougar, and so they would put them in different genus. But then we get the genome back, and we discover, you put a different genus name on the cheetah than we have on the cougar, but they are, in fact, genetically practically the same thing. And now we also have fossils that show that cheetahs were in North America at one point, so that they originated here, and that they are, in fact, close cousins to cougars. Now, of course, that supports evolution, but then that's the data from the genome. A computer, not just a child can see that, but a computer can see that. A computer doesn't have to have any human biases or assumptions. The computer identifies that cheetahs and cougars are essentially the same thing, that they should be in the same genus, and that we should develop a construct that reflects that, because that's the truth of it, and that we should honor that.
Why does Georgia say that current biologists are upset with Carl Linnaeus? Why would she use that phrase?
Creationists like to project their own faults onto those who will not share them. So when she has a problem, she wants to accuse us of having the problem that she has, even though we don't have that problem. It's a condition that I call the pot calling the silverware black.
And this troop
does that quite a bit. The guy in blue who gets bored when he hears reality, he does that quite a bit.
But fair to say that biologists are attempting to improve a process. They're not angry at a process.
Exactly. If it doesn't work, if it needs improvements, then we have to fix it. And that's not what they do. They don't want a more accurate system, because they know what accuracy means. It means supporting the evolutionary position.
And so that's where evolutionists struggle with that, because, this doesn't really reflect at least their reality.
Creationists had to invent baraminology and a number of apologetics. The apologetics exist because reality doesn't accept their alternate reality. So they have to come up with alternate facts, which are also known as lies.
At least their reality. And so we need to change it. And so they've come up with a new way to do that. Now, they're not saying they're going to change the genus and species names of the organisms. That's binomial nomenclature.
They actually are changing the genus and species name. At least they're wandering away from binomial nomenclature, and that is because we understand that evolution happens. And so that when you have Canis lupus, for example, it's Canis lupus familiaris, because that's already a trinomial. But then what happens when you go further? When a new breed becomes its own species or subspecies classification, then it warrants another name. So is it Canis lupus familiaris dachshund? We have to come up with some consideration for that. How do we do this accurately? We can't adhere to the binomial nomenclature when it doesn't work anymore, or when it's no longer informative. And just because it's tradition doesn't mean we should still be using it.
They're not going to change that, but they're going to change sort of the higher order ones and how they're all organized. And they're actually going to organize them, look at this lovely chart,
right.
According to clades. And clade is supposedly all the organisms come from a common ancestor within a clade. So that's how they want to organize it. So what do you think about this, Brian?
I fell asleep again, if you can wake me back up. No,
Why don't you just give that guy a ball and go send him into a corner to maybe he can bounce it? Why the hell is he even on camera?
He's got the pretty smile. He's in charge of their homeschool curriculum, if you can.
Oh, my word. What kind of injustice is that?
A guy who falls asleep whenever he hears information.
Was that a reasonable definition of clade that Georgia gave there?
Yeah, a clade is inclusive of all of the subsets of that. For example, the one that people have trouble with, the word tetrapod. Tetrapod is a organism that has 4 legs and is skeletally adapted for life on land. Okay, so we have all these organisms that crawled out on the land, and they have 4 legs now, except that now we also have snakes and whales are 2 famous examples where they've lost 2 or more of their limbs for whatever reason, but they're still classified as tetrapods. For the same reason, we have certain criteria for what is a human, right? The brain size, CCs, the limbs, fingers, we have the typical character traits. But if a person is born that is missing arms or legs or has a sub-sized brain, we don't say that they're not human. Because if you're born to humans, then you're human. It doesn't matter that you have a different set of characteristics or that you don't meet those requirements anymore, because it's not character-based. It's based on your phylogeny. It's based on your ancestry. So the children of humans are always going to be human, even if we evolve into 2 different sets. If it was that we were to, say, a colony moves off to Mars and they're no longer physically interbreeding with us, very quickly that small population would become distinctly different. If over enough generations, they would no longer be chemically interfertile with us if they were isolated. And then we would have two different species, both of them human. But it's just because one of them is different than the other doesn't mean that they're not human anymore.
So she actually gave a good definition. That's surprising.
Unwittingly, yes.
I don't fault them for doing that, but what we would say is they have the wrong foundation.
Right.
The wrong history of the universe that gives them the wrong conclusions. And it's so sad to me.
He doesn't fault us for doing the very thing that he himself is doing, but that we are not doing. These are not assumptions. We do not assume that evolution is happening. We know that evolution is happening. And people have tried to explain how that's happening. How did we manage to derive all these different breeds of cattle that didn't exist in the wild when all we had originally was aurochs? How did we breed all of these different types of dogs when originally all we had was Asiatic wolves? How did we breed all of these different types of pigeons when we had one original stock? How did all of these different varieties come from one common ancestor? So we know that that's happening. There's nobody questioning that. That's not an assumption. That's known. That's a fact. So then people like Lamarck comes along and he says, maybe this is what's happening. And then we test Lamarck's theory and we say, well, you know what? It has some credence, maybe in some perspective, but that's essentially not what's going on here. So Lamarckism is pushed aside. That does not account for what's really happening. That explanation doesn't work. And then Darwin comes along and he says, well, maybe this is what's happening. And so we test that. And we're like, you know what? That works. That actually is what's happening. And then other people come in later, like when Gregor Mendel comes in, he comes up with genetics. And now genetics adds to that explanation. And then we discover mutations. And that adds to that explanation too. And so all subsequent research all compiles and shows that Darwin's theory is actually the working theory. And these are not assumptions. These are tried and true, tested and proven over and over and over and over again. So we know that this happens. And the guy who's in charge of education, who desperately needs an education, has no idea how much he doesn't know. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. And the problem is, he won't know. Because remember, ignorance, right? Ignore is an important part of the word ignorance. Ignorance isn't just what you don't know, it's also what you won't know.
Because you got some brilliant people who are very smart in particular areas, wasting, really, in a sense, their time, their efforts, and their resources to try to prove a mythological history that never took place.
Excuse me, that's your job. That's what you're doing. You're an apologist. You are accusing us of doing the thing that you're doing, but that we are not doing. We have made huge advances in virology and toxicology and in medicine. Understanding evolution has given us huge boons and saved billions of lives in understanding how evolutionary processes work. What have we gained from pretending, yes, pretending, because that's all you can do, that things were created? There's no value there. There's no such thing as creation. Nobody's ever created anything. We've watched evolution happen in the lab. We've manipulated it throughout the entire history of agriculture. There's an enormous benefit to that. But there is no benefit at all to lying to people to say that evolution doesn't happen and that your magic imaginary friend poofed things out of nothing with magic words. Abracadabra, I create as I speak. That's where this guy's coming from. You know where the only benefit comes from that? That Answers in Genesis makes something on the order of $20 million a year by bilking people that have much more money than they have sense. That's where that comes from.
Stop promoting myths, says the man who's literally sitting in front of a magic boat and a talking snake.
Which is why they actually say in the article, so why do we keep trying to put what we know about evolution in a system that wasn't built to reflect it? Well, because evolution won't fit into a system that was designed to reflect God's creation.
It wasn't designed to reflect God's creation. It was thought that it would. Carolus Linnaeus created the concept of taxonomy, thinking that he was going to identify created kinds. In a sense, he was taking the phylogeny challenge. But what he found instead did not reflect created kinds. The fact that he could not distinguish humans from apes, that they were, in his mind, the same thing, that biologically they are the same thing, indistinguishable from each other, does not fit creation. So he was the one who originated the phylogeny challenge. He came up with a quandary he could not answer because he was a pre-Darwinian creationist, and we had to wait another century for Darwin to come along to answer the dilemma that Linnaeus had discovered.
So, since I don't think they're going to get to it and go over it, what are some of the shortcomings in the Linnaean system that necessitates kind of a shift to this Phylocode system?
Well, because Linnaean taxonomy has made a number of mistakes in the way that it has constructed some things. And as I said, like with the example of the cheetah and the cougar, there's actually several. There's only so much that you can do classifying organisms by their morphology. On occasion, you'll have where a morphology implies that maybe these two are more closely related than these other ones. But the thing that does it, that makes phylogenetics twin-nested, is that it's based initially in morphology, and then it's also backed by embryology, because embryology provides this whole nother overlapping scheme where you can chart embryology to match the same tree. Very rarely will you get a difference where the embryology doesn't match, and that means you need to go to something that is more hard-coded, something that will prove the point, and that's where you get into genetics. So when you use the genome comparisons, you find an ortholog, and this is how they verified that. Like, for example, it was determined that aardvarks and anteaters and pangolins, because they were all toothless and they all eat ants. So this must have been the commonality, that they had a common ancestor who lost their teeth and had to eat ants as a necessity, and so they developed into aardvarks and anteaters and pangolins. A reasonably fair assessment, except for the fact that pangolins are way more primal than that. But when they get the genome back, they discover that these are three different groups that just coincidentally, convergently, lost their teeth and had to eat ants. Their biological relationship is that aardvarks are afrotherians. They're actually more closely related to elephants than they are to anteaters. And likewise, the pangolins, strangely, turned out to be more closely related to carnivores than to anteaters. And anteaters are xenarthrans, which are a South American derivative. So the early mammals branched into two directions, and then each of those two branches branched into two more. We can verify this through the genome. These are not assumptions. These are verified fact. Now, if you want to talk about assumptions, look at Answers in Genesis. That's all they have, and they will not question those. Science has to make assumptions, but then test them. When Lamarck comes up with his idea, well, maybe that's a good idea. Thank you for thinking that. Now let's test that assumption. Nope, doesn't work. Darwin comes up with one. Let's test that one. Hey, that works. Over and over and over, time again, every possible test, all the evidence we ever find, everything always only ever backs that up. And we have an artificial system like Carolus Linnaeus comes up with taxonomy, and he doesn't think that new species can evolve, then he devises a system that doesn't allow for evolution. And so when we can prove that this does happen, then we need a system that can accommodate that fact.
Am I also right in thinking that the rigid 7-layer system is kind of restrictive, that it's better to have a flexible number of groups? Is that...
Yeah, that's a very important point that you bring up. So it was realized early on that there are way more classifications within that than just the 7. I mean, within human lineage alone, we have at least 70, not 7, 70 named clades that we sit into. And those are just the ones with names, because there's quite a lot of them that don't have names. We just use names as like a signpost so that we don't get lost.
Mm-hmm.
The tree of life is so enormous that most people have no concept of how big it is. It's almost like mapping synapses in the brain. It's just really freaking huge. So when you think about just 70 named clades, people were trying to add to that 7-layer system, to add an infraorder or a suborder or a parvorder, and they just come up with all these different names to subdivide everything into until they realize, why are we doing this? Because what is an order on this level isn't an order on this level. What is, the families are not all even divisions.
Right.
So realizing that, let's just scrap the whole system. And we can keep some of the names, again, as signposts so that people don't get lost. That's the only adherence we'll have to tradition. And then beyond that,
we'll have clades, and the clades will represent everything that descends from that. To say what I just said before, if a whale and a snake, we both know that their ancestors had legs. We have fossils for both that had legs. So those things remain tetrapods. Even if they don't have the physical characteristics anymore, their ancestry demands that they be classified as tetrapods, and they will always be tetrapods even if they never have legs again.
Talking about the Linnaeus system, that we've used since the 1700s, they said, well, these ranks are ultimately human constructs and often rely on subjective criteria which can lead to confusion and instability. And I'm like, and the Phylocode isn't?
Exactly. The Phylocode isn't. And there's an illustration of this that's quite beautiful. They plugged 3,000 genomes into a computer system. Computer doesn't have any biases, it doesn't have any religion, it doesn't have any intent of design. So there's not going to be any arbitrary constructs. It is basically doing a genetic paternity test on all of the genomes that it puts in. So it's going to file them all as to what belongs in what subcategories, what belongs in what parent categories, and which ones belong closest together. So you feed 3,000 genomes in, and it produces a tumbleweed of life, a taxonomic tree that is in the vast circle, which really does look a bit like a tumbleweed. But this was a computer doing this. So it is not arbitrary. It's not by, assumptions. These are the facts of the data, and even a computer will work that out. And a computer will work that out. It doesn't have any choice in the matter. It doesn't want to render it this way. This is the way it really is.
If I could count the number of times they change evolutionary trees, I would be a millionaire.
On the other hand, if my income was based on the number of times creationists incorporated new data into their models, I'd be living in a box on a sidewalk somewhere.
They have had to change the evolutionary tree a few times for the reasons that I've just given, but everything she's talking about leading to confusion and all of that, the tens of thousands of Christian denominations violently conflicting with each other, and that's just one religion out of many. And these people are denying most of other Christianity. Remember that there are educated Christians, Francis Crick and Robert T. Bacher and Kenneth Miller. Francis Collins is the director of the Human Genome Project. These are all educated Christians who know and can show the facts of the matter and how that does not support the young earth creationism nonsense. But we know that they know that, right? Ken Ham has already come out and admitted that he has seen the evidence. He simply rejects it. He knows that there is evidence that dinosaurs had brain cancer and so forth. But how could that be if everything was created good? And he's said many times, he describes it as God glasses, but psychologists refer to it as confirmation bias, where he simply ignores all the evidence that is against him because he's going to believe what he wants to believe.
It's crazy.
Well, pretty much every single show, we have a few articles that say evolution is rewritten by this brand new discovery. It happens almost every single time, so it's a consistent thing.
We have some today.
Yes, I was saying we have some today.
Right?
Yeah.
Sadly, Blue Shirt is right about that. And I've criticized the sensationalism of the media a number of times on stage and on video, because it's true that every time we have a new discovery that reaffirms the status quo, the reporter will always say that it causes scientists to question their theories and rewrites history. Very often, they're exactly what we predicted. And I can think of a number of examples where what they found was predicted decades earlier. It exactly fit what we were already looking for, didn't cause us to rewrite anything. But you can't sell newspapers if you don't sensationalize. And so that's what the news reporters are doing. That's why you don't ever want to get your science from the mainstream media. I mean, never.
Right.
Always look up the original story in the peer-reviewed articles, because very often the reporters will tell you that the study says something the study does not actually say.
So that's the problem. They keep talking about increased clarity and it's not going to change that much. And I'm thinking, do you understand what you're basing this off of? They have to be. They've been working on this for 20 years, so certainly they're aware of it. But I think it's just kind of sweeping it under the rug so they can continue these evolutionary ideas.
This is the person who's defending baraminology, talking about how actual biologists using genetic orthologs are somehow sweeping talking snakes and donkeys and magic spells and golems and such under the rug? Really?
And I looked up a quote from Linnaeus about creation and the order of things, and Linnaeus said this: "The earth's creation is the glory of God, as seen from the works of nature by man alone. The study of nature would reveal the divine order of God's creation."
Yeah.
Oh, that more scientists would speak like that today.
Except that this isn't 1735. We've learned things since then. Why was the classification of Pongo created? It was created to arbitrarily divide chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans from humans. So they set up an all of them except for us category. That was what Pongo was. And if you're going to admit that it's all of them except for us, then that's a Freudian admission that you already know we are part of that group and that you've just set this up artificially. So some 20 years ago, again, the genome verifies we are more closely related to chimpanzees and gorillas collectively than they are to orangutans. And we are more closely related to gorillas than gorillas are to baboons. So we understand this genetically. And they knew a lot of that. Thomas Huxley was arguing that in the 1860s. So we have to go with what the information entails. Answers in Genesis has to go with the fairy tale regardless of the evidence. And we know that that's the case because Answers in Genesis hasn't made in their statement of faith that no amount of evidence of any kind from any field can ever be accepted if it contradicts the fairy tale. And when they have scientists with it, because they do hire actual scientists to work there, but the scientists have to they have to reaffirm that same oath, and that they will support the fable of biblical literalism regardless what the facts are. No matter what, they can never concede that Genesis got anything wrong, ever. It doesn't matter how often it gets things wrong. It doesn't matter how egregiously it gets this wrong. It doesn't matter how gigantic the error is. They can never admit it. It is the most dishonest position that is possible to have, except for the fact that they are admitting that they will never admit when they're wrong. They are wrong, they just won't ever admit it. And they admit that they'll admit that, or that they admit that they won't admit that.
Okay, moving on.
All right. Did life emerge in the primordial soup via DNA or RNA? A surprising answer. Here you go, Brian, from new research.
Look at that.
Yes.
So exciting.
As we
Let's
were just
rewrite the whole
talking
thing.
about.
Hey, someone woke Brian.
Evolutionists don't like to deal with origin of life issues. They'd rather deal with what happened after that, okay? They don't typically even deal with those.
Well, since the scientific field of biological evolution is a subset of biology, those you would call evolutionists are really biologists. Now, origin of life research is more the domain of chemistry, or some overlap with biochemistry, but it's an entirely different field, different specialty, a different discipline. George is complaining that biologists aren't typically doing chemistry, a critique like complaining that Shakespeare typically didn't make his own ink or paper, or that chefs typically don't smelt their own pans, or that few professional baseball players stitch their own gloves. They're related, but they're not.
They just, because it's hard, they don't know, and there's no way to explain how life comes from non-life, because in a biological sense, life always comes from life. That is a law, the law of biogenesis. So basically, you have to go against that law.
That life comes from life is not a law. It was a law, and creationists often misrepresent it. They call it the biogenetic law, but actually the biogenetic law was the law of recapitulation that Ernst Haeckel came up with. But the idea that life comes from life actually came from Rudolf Virchow, who was a pioneer geneticist. And he initially said, he did once upon a time say that life comes from life. And also he said that cells come from cells, and he was forced to say that diseased cells come from diseased cells. But then he realized there's a paradox there, that at some point a diseased cell had to come from a healthy cell, that you didn't just have diseased cells coming from diseased cells. So there had to be another catalyst that had a way for a healthy cell to become diseased. So he refuted his own law, and that caused him to reconsider his previous stipulation that life comes from life. So he undid his own law when he invented the concept of abiogenesis. He then changed it. The law is now that life comes from a prior matrix. That's what Rudolf Virchow said. The very guy who made the law that life comes from life changed it, revised it, and made a new law, life comes from a prior matrix. And Thomas Huxley coined the name of that as abiogenesis a few years later.
It's so infinitely complex how you do that. I mean, it sounds easy when you hear it, but being a geneticist and knowing how that works, it's very, very complex.
It's true that we don't know as much about abiogenesis as we do about evolution, because we can prove all kinds of stuff about evolution, and there's only a couple dozen experiments that we have that we can show abiogenesis position. So of course we want to focus on the things that we can prove to be true that they still deny. And so why do they want to talk only about abiogenesis and only about Big Bang cosmology? Because they have to push things all the way back. If we can't understand every detail right now, that means we won't understand it in 100 years. There's a whole lot we didn't understand 100 years ago that we have answered that they will never admit. As if how the universe began or how life began had any impact over the fact that humans are a subset of apes and that evolution is still directly observable and confirmable even under controlled conditions. They don't want to talk about that, so they want to go back to wherever the God of the gaps is, wherever they think there's a safe place, in wherever science can't explain, because they want to pretend, which is another falsehood, and it's a logical fallacy too, they want to pretend that whatever science can't answer is somehow evidence for their magic imaginary friend.
It's sort of a chicken, which came first, the chicken or the egg, okay? Now, obviously, as creationists, the chicken came first, okay? Because the chicken was created on day 5 with all the other flying creatures, and then eggs came after that.
The thing about creationism, it's a form of religious extremism, but it just takes the worst of Christianity and turns it up to 11. It's all about absolving responsibility. You don't have to actually do anything to make reparations for the things you've done wrong. You just pretend that your magic imaginary friend has forgiven you. And then they don't have to be responsible for the environment either, because it doesn't matter how many more souls we bring unto the Lord. It doesn't matter that you can't feed all your kids, because Jesus is going to return any minute now to save us from ourselves. And he's going to roast the planet anyway. And they're not able to think hypothetically. They ask me all the time, what if you're wrong? But when I say, okay, well then Jesus would show up and we'd have a pristine world where everybody's happy, and he would waste that for no reason. But what if you're wrong? And then the only answer is, I'm not wrong. Yeah, you are, goober. But the problem is you can't even think hypothetically because you have to believe in a lie. And it is a lie. When you state as fact baseless assertions that are unsupported by evidence, that's a lie. Just like when you pretend to know things that no one even can know. Well, I know for a fact that God exists. But no, you don't, because knowledge is demonstrable with measurable accuracy. You can show what you know. We can test it. But if you can't verify the accuracy of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you don't actually know that. You only think you do. That's only what you believe. And when I say believe, and they say believe, it means something different. I don't even use the word anymore. I'll say I don't think that's the case, because it was that what I believe is what I think is most likely true or closest to the truth, because I try not to work in absolutes. But when they say believe, they mean make believe. It's what they pretend. And that's what this is all about. And that's why they have apologetics, which is systematically making up excuses to rationalize or justify or dismiss any and all evidence against their preferred position. That's what apologetics is. And it's one of the things that makes faith the most dishonest position it is possible to have.
Well, that sounds like a perfect place to end it. Thank you so much for stopping by, Aaron.
How are all things in your merry world?
Things are all right. Where I live, things are starting to open up a little faster than I'm personally comfortable with. I'm a little scared of these second and third waves.
Oh, yeah.
It seems to me religious organizations like Answers and Genesis are at the forefront of pushing these floodgates open.
Yeah, I'm here in Texas, of course.
Yep.
You know, the American Alberta.
Yep.
Yeah, it's much the same thing.
Kind of tough to make predictions in the world we're in now, but hopefully we're paving the way to be down there for Faithless Forum 2021. We'll hit some more barbecue places. You're buying.
Yeah, I like that.
If for some reason you're not already subscribed to AronRa's YouTube channel, you should definitely fix that immediately, as he's been doing an amazing job recently of advancing biology education on many fronts, including phylogeny. He's not just addressing creation claims. And if you are already subscribed, perhaps consider becoming an AronRa patron, as he's a full-time advocate and educator, and it's been a tricky year for support. Speaking of which, thank you so much to my patrons, without whom my work on this channel would not be possible. Thank you so much for watching. And since you're still here, the video on the screen is a pretty great choice of what to watch next. Give it a tap, and I'll see you over there.
Yeah, these people really irritate the fuck out of me.
Really? You're so subtle. I can't tell sometimes.